A typical week for a developer when you're working on a project certainly is looking at what you've got. So you'll have a list of tasks you need to complete within your project. You'll split that down into smaller chunks of work, and you may develop, say, a piece of functionality which does, I don't know, in my current role, for example, it would be developing a piece of functionality for a client which allowed them to track information about people they work with, for example. So I'd go away and I'd develop that. You'd also have several meetings with the project consultants. So there'll be a team who actually design what you're working on. So they'll go away, they'll be the client-facing people that will have the meetings with the clients. They'll then pass on something for me to develop. I'll look through that. If it meets what I need to develop it, then I'll go away and I'll actually start programming that. Or I may go back to them and say, I don't understand this, or we need a bit more information about how a certain piece of functionality should work. And you'll go away and you'll send that back to them, and there'll be a bit of back and forth. So there's some internal meetings.
So it's important that you have a very clear specification.
Exactly, yeah. So having a clear specification that you understand and that contains everything you need to be a developer and develop that application is key. If you've got a rubbish specification, you can't develop what the client wants. It's actually quite easy to measure a developer in that the client, essentially the client you're working with, will have an expectation. They'll expect to see something at the end once you've finished developing what you're doing. So when that's delivered to them, if they're not happy with it, if it doesn't do what they want, then clearly you haven't achieved what you're supposed to. Now, there are exceptions to that. For example, you may have been given a bad design specification, and that's why often as a developer, certainly in my role, you'll spend some time with clients yourself. So you may sit in while a consultant is going through the motions of trying to gather those requirements. You may be sitting there, first of all, for your own understanding, so you've heard it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, but also to help you be able to say, because you understand the way the programming works, you can suggest things which maybe the consultant may not have thought of, because you're the one with that knowledge of how programming works, how the product you're working with works. So you can often help to shape design decisions, and as a developer that's something which is really helpful, because if you're shaping the decisions, then you can say exactly, you know exactly what you're going to do, whereas if somebody just hands you a specification and you've got no clue, you often have to think about it and break that down. You have objectives to keep the number of bugs in testing down to a minimum. So once you've developed an application, you'll send it to a testing team. So it's always best to do your own testing, have your own test scripts written out before you start, so you know what you're looking for at the end, what the end product is. Once that's done, you hand it over to another team internally who do some internal testing. They'll have their test scripts, which generally they don't share with you because that obviously defeats the object of testing. So you'll go through, they'll do their testing, and the aim is to keep the bugs to the minimum. So you may get some bugs which are just things you've missed. Hopefully the bugs you get most of the times will just be misunderstandings in how the specification has been written, and that's why it's really key to make sure as a developer you're comfortable with what you've been given and that you know exactly where you need to be working and what level you need to be working at. Some of the dislikes are, although you work on lots of different projects, a lot of the time the things you do will be the same. So the clients you work with will have kind of 10% of what they want will be the same throughout all of the projects. So there is some repetition involved. It's nice, conversely, one of the good points, it's nice when you get really big projects that have lots of different new things and get you thinking in new ways, but there are portions of it which can become quite repetitive. Another downside, I guess, would be you're a level extracted from the end user. So although you can go along to some of the meetings, not all programming roles will actually allow you to ever speak to the client. So you've got a group of people interacting with the client and you have no control over what you're going to be given in the end. And if you're in a situation where the consultants aren't systems project minded, you can be handed a project and a design specification by somebody that doesn't really understand programming, and that can make it really difficult for you to actually develop something which meets those client requirements. So, and that's something which will vary, based on where you work, who you're working with.
The positives?
The positives are that when you are working on these big new projects, you can get some really exciting new challenges, yeah, and you're constantly thinking of new ways to do things. So it's not a case of every project you do will be identical. Like I said before, there are some similarities, but there are differences as well. So you're being stretched all of the time. And as a programmer in terms of the industry, there's lots of different things you can do. I mean, there's hundreds of languages out there you can program in. So if you get bored of doing one thing, you can easily upskill yourself in something else. Once you understand the fundamentals, you could sit watching an online tutorial and within the space of a couple of weeks be fully versed in a new programming language and look for roles in that. So you're not tied down to being with the same company doing the same role for your entire career.